chapter because chapter 21 talks about the digestive system and its organs and anatomy. And then chapter 22 then sort of follows the nutrients around the body in terms of what those nutrients do. So chapter 21 and chapter 22 are sort of closely related. All right, so where are we? We talked about the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, and now we're going to add in the digestive system. So this is sort of a concept diagram of the organ systems of the body and what they do. So essentially, it's all about the cells, right? It's about the tissue cells of the body. So that's skeletal muscle, that's skin, that's brain, organ, all of the cells of the body have needs. And essentially, you can break it down like this. So all of the cells need oxygen, and they need to get rid of CO2. So that's what we talked about in the last chapter, right? How oxygen gets into the body, how it gets transported in the blood and out to the tissues, and then how CO2 gets transported in reverse back to the lungs so it can be exhaled. So that's the red and the blue. CO2 out, oxygen in. Well, and we already talked about the cardiovascular system, the circuit that's going to move nutrients and waste products around. So now we add in the digestive tract, and its role is to bring in nutrients, which are our black line here. And that's because all cells, in addition to oxygen, they need nutrients as well. So one of the reasons they need nutrients is as fuel, to generate ATP from, as CO2 is produced and oxygen is used to essentially burn compounds to release energy. But cells also need nutrients for lots of other things too. Not the least of which is as building blocks to build things. So to build proteins, to build new cells, cell membranes, things like that. And we'll talk about the things that the cells do and use in the next chapter when we talk about metabolism and energetics. And then after the exam, we'll touch on this last system, and that is cells have other waste products to get rid of besides CO2. We're not as clean burning as that. Most of what we use up does become CO2, but the nitrogen, for example, has to leave the body in another way. So this green system is the urinary system, which we'll talk about after this next unit exam. All right, so here we are today, the digestive system. All right, so what the overview, or what pieces make this up? We essentially have two parts of the digestive tract. We have the long tube, which has multiple names. The digestive tract, we call it. We call it the alimentary canal, which you may have heard those terms used in your previous science classes. And then, so that muscular tube, it starts at the mouth, it ends at the anus, and it's one tube all the way through. So, esophagus, or from mouth to esophagus to stomach, stomach to small intestine to large intestine, then large intestine to rectum, and rectum out to anus. So that's the tract, or the canal. Now then, associated with that are these accessory organs. So these organs are part of the digestive system, even though they're not technically part of the digestive tract, or the GI tract. GI is gastrointestinal, and you'll hear that referred to, the term used often when people talk about the digestive system. And you'll also just hear the digestive tract called the gut. And when they talk about the gut, they're not talking about beer belly. They're talking about the whole digestive tract in general. So even your gastroenterologists, people that focus on this system, will oftentimes just call it the gut too. So out there in clinical land, you'll hear that as well. All right, so what are the accessory organs? Well, we have the salivary glands. There's three pairs of those that we'll talk about. We have the liver, the largest solid organ in the body, and it has more functions than we could get to in an entire semester. But we're going to talk just a little bit about what some of the things it does. And then the gallbladder, which is closely associated with the liver. And finally the pancreas, which sits here underneath the stomach and has both a digestive system role and an endocrine system role. So we already talked about it as an endocrine organ. You know, we talked about glucagon and insulin in our first chapter together this semester. Now we'll get to see the rest of what the pancreas does. All right, so we're going to talk about sort of each of these in turn. Okay. So, you know, textbooks are different, and different authors and different publishers take different approaches to you know, the same material. And while I'm not going to test you on these 4 concepts, I have always found them to be a nice way to separate and organize what the digestive tract does. Because essentially every part of the digestive tract is involved in one or more of these 4 things. So I just want to introduce these words to you because many other anatomy textbooks will use this 4-word sort of concept to talk about the GI tract. All right, so motility, that word, is movement. And this is how things move in the digestive tract or how they are changed by movement. So for example, you know, you take a bite of something and, you know, what do? Well, you chew it up. Well, that chewing, that's movement. And what you've put in your mouth is altered by that movement, right? You know, it becomes squishier, wetter, and then eventually you swallow it. Well, the whole GI tract has motion as part of what it does. So, like the stomach, for example, churns and bends and contracts and relaxes and further sort of mixes up what's in the GI tract. So, as we look at these different regions of the GI tract, motility, how it moves, is something you should know, okay? The second word is digestion. And this is another one of those spots where I want you to leave the class knowing something different than how you came in. If you went and you asked 100 people on the street what digestion is, they would not give you the correct answer. They would tell you something about food or getting nutrients from food or whatever. Digestion is a chemical word. It's a chemistry word. And what it means is taking a large molecule and breaking it up into smaller pieces. That is digestion. So even though the digestive system has its name, digestion is just one part of what it does, right? So all of the molecules in the food that we eat, or at least the vast majority, are long chains of molecules. You know, that's how life on this planet does things. It takes building block molecules and it pieces them together into these long chains. So like, amino acids are chained together to make proteins. Sugars are chained together to make carbohydrates like starches. Even fats are chained together to make triglycerides. So digestion is dechaining those things. So, for example, with a protein, you know, you've got a long string of amino acids. Digestion is breaking those amino acids apart into their building block units. So from protein to amino acid, from carbohydrate to sugar, and we'll see some examples of digestion as we, particularly in the next chapter when we look at the nutrients. Okay, so digestion, that's the thing the digestive tract does. Absorption. There is no point in doing digestion unless then you're going to move those building block molecules into the body, right? So a big part of what the small intestine in particular evolved to be for is absorption. Getting the building block molecules that have been broken up into the bloodstream so that they can be moved around the body and used by the cells. All right, so absorption. And then secretion is often required to make digestion and absorption happen. And what secretion is what the digestive tract has put in to the GI tract in order to accomplish digestion and absorption. So it isn't a one-way ticket. You know, we put food in our mouths and immediately we start adding stuff to what has been ingested. You know, in the mouth, it's saliva. In the stomach, it's stomach secretion, so gastric acid, pepsin, things like that. So all along the path, the digestive tract is adding things to what has gone in the mouth. And the reason it does that is to make digestion happen so that absorption can happen. All right? So these 4 digestive system words and all the parts of the digestive tract have some role in all 4 of these, as we'll see as we go on here. So, and a different approach to understanding the digestive tract, but I think it's a good one. Okay. So the vast majority of the GI tract shares a lot in common with each other. And so this is sort of the typical look or layers of the GI tract. So this is most of your small intestine. This is most of your large intestine. Even the stomach. They all have the same basic organization. All right, so let's go through it. Well, the innermost layer, the layer that sits right next to the contents, which we call chyme. So chyme is food that has had saliva and other digestive secretions added to it, right? We don't call it food because nobody would want to eat that, okay? But it used to be food. It just had stuff added to it. So that's what we find in here is chyme. So sitting right next to the chyme on the innermost layer of this tube is the mucosa. And the mucosa is made up of many, many cells that have evolved to have lots of surface area, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So that's the mucosa, the layer right next to the contents. Underneath the mucosa, here it's sort of light purple, is the submucosa. Sub meaning below, so below the mucosa is the submucosa. And its importance is that this is where the blood vessels are that are going to take the nutrients away from the digestive tract and out to the rest of the body, right? So we have blood vessels and lymphatic vessels in this region. Deep to the submucosa is 2 layers of smooth muscle. And together we call those the muscularis externa. And these 2 layers are organized in 2 patterns. So the inner layer is circular. In other words, it goes around the tube, right? And the outer layer is longitudinal, which means it goes along the tube. So we have 2 arrangements, and that allows this tube to alter its shape in a variety of different ways, which I'll show you in a minute when we talk about motility. All right, so that's the muscularis externa. And then the outermost layer is called the serosa. And the serosa is smooth, slick, and it secretes a small amount of slippery sort of lubricating fluid that allows the various parts of the digestive tract to kind of slide around each other. Because very much in the abdomen, things are in motion. So anytime you have things in motion, you need to have some kind of lubrication so that things don't get stuck together. And that's primarily what the serosa then does. All right. And then this tube kind of hangs from a double sheet of tissue called the mesentery, which we'll talk more about in a little while. All right. So the principal message of this slide is the 4 layers of the digestive tract. So mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and then the serosa along the outside. So if we zoom in to one little part here, you start to see a pattern in the digestive tract, and that is folds. So the GI tract is folds of folds of folds, right? Well, why? Well, imagine you take a king-size sheet and you put it on a twin bed. It's going to have to, but you don't want it to touch the ground, right? One way to do that is to wrinkle it up, right? So you've taken a large surface area and you put it in a smaller space. So anything that is folded or wrinkly has more surface area than a thing that's smooth. Well, why does surface area matter? Because it's across the surface that nutrients are going to be absorbed. So the more surface you have, the easier that absorption process can be. So if we look, first we see, okay, this tube isn't smooth inside, it's wrinkly. Well, those wrinkles are to expand that surface area. And so if we zoom in, and they have a name, each of these folds that you can see with the naked eye is called a plica circularis. A circular fold is all that fancy word means. And then stacked up on these folds and in between the folds are this sort of carpet-like appearance of cells. And we call those villi. So if you look very closely at carpeting, you'll see that it has little tufts of individual fibers that come up. Well, if this is a carpet, each tuft is called a villus. All right, a villi is the plural, villus is the singular, and that just means hill. So if we zoom in, we see all these little tufts sticking up. And there again, it's to increase surface area. If this was smooth, there wouldn't be as much surface for nutrients to pass through. And then coming up through the center of this plica is where you can start to see arteries, veins, and lymphatics. And the lymphatic vessels in the digestive tract play a very important role. So it's worth sort of paying attention to the fact that there is lymphatics in here as well. All right. So, and then each of these villi has those layers that we talked about. So it has the mucosa on the outside, the submucosa, and then the muscularis externa is way down here. So folds of folds of folds. All right. Now this outermost layer that makes motion happen in the GI tract is made up of smooth muscle. So far in the 2 semesters of the course, we talked about skeletal muscle, right? We talked a lot about it, including all about how it worked last semester. We talked about cardiac muscle in the cardiovascular unit. So this is the third type of muscle, which is smooth muscle. And it has some things in common with skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, but in many ways it is very, very different. So smooth muscle is, it gets its name because under the microscope, it doesn't have striations. You know, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, they look like there's patterns of light and dark that alternate, which comes from the sarcomeres, the sarcomere arrangement. Well, smooth muscle doesn't have sarcomeres, so it doesn't have striations. So it gets its name smooth because it doesn't look rough or bumpy like skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle do. So if it doesn't have sarcomeres, how is it able to contract? Well, it's a different arrangement. So if you look at a smooth muscle cell when it's relaxed, you can see this sort of crisscross pattern. And these are actin and myosin filaments, just like we find in skeletal muscle. But instead of being arranged in a sarcomere, they're more loosely arranged in this kind of net type organization. And so when these smooth muscle cells contract, all of these threads here sort of all contract. And what we get is a change in shape like this. So we go from this kind of eye-shaped thing to this sort of wrinkled ball of sorts. So one of the things that makes smooth muscle different is it contracts in all dimensions at once. A skeletal muscle just gets shorter in one dimension, right? And a cardiac muscle, pretty much the same thing. It only gets shorter in one or maybe a couple of directions. Smooth muscle gets smaller in all directions at once. So it can make sheets. If you took skeletal muscle and you made a big sheet of it, when it contracted, it would only get shorter in one direction. If you have smooth muscle in a big sheet and it contracts, the whole sheet gets smaller, right? Because it's contracting in all dimensions at once, like we see here. So smooth muscle always, or smooth muscle cells always come together. In other words, they work as sort of many cells working as one. So in skeletal muscle, we had lots of cells that became one giant cell that then contracted together. Well, in smooth muscle, the cells work together, even though they're separate cells, to all contract at the same time. All right, so no sarcomeres, but still active in myosin. And the trigger for contraction for smooth muscle cells is calcium, just like we saw in skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. So that they all three share in common. All right, so we have this arrangement and contraction in all directions at once. Okay. So generally speaking, there's two kinds of smooth muscle. One is very common and one is pretty uncommon in the body. So the most common kind is visceral smooth muscle, which is what we find in the GI tract. In visceral smooth muscle, the smooth muscle cells are connected together not only physically, in other words, they're bound tightly to each other, but also chemically. You know, we talked about gap junctions and how they allow stuff to go from one cell to another sort of directly. They're like little straws like this. So a change in this cell can be passed to the next cell, without having to go out into the extracellular environment. Well, visceral smooth muscle has lots of those gap junctions. And because of that, a signal that arrives at one cell is passed to the other cells. And typically, in this visceral smooth muscle, a few of the smooth muscle cells, they'll have, they'll sort of contract automatically from time to time, like the pacemaker in the heart does. So visceral smooth muscle, the smooth muscle cells are connected to each other. There are pace setter cells, and then the nervous system can exert some control over the group of smooth muscle cells, right? The much less common form of smooth muscle is the multi-unit smooth muscle. And in many ways, this smooth muscle behaves more like skeletal muscle does, where the nervous system has to stimulate its activity. So, one example of this is in the eye. There's examples in the reproductive tract, walls of arteries, things like that, but much less common than the visceral smooth muscle. So here, the nervous system stimulates every contraction. Here, in the visceral smooth muscle, most contraction is self-stimulated. In other words, the nervous system doesn't have to make it happen. It will happen all by itself intrinsically. So it's visceral smooth muscle is what we find in the GI tract. So now you've learned about all the three types of muscle. And remember that muscle is one of the four principal tissues in the body, right? So there's epithelium, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle. So now you've learned about all three of the muscle types. All right. So what does that smooth muscle do in the GI tract? Well, primarily, it's going to create motility or motion. So in the end, food goes in the mouth, and it has to make its way all the way through the rest of the digestive tract. That means it's going to have to be pushed somehow, because it's not exactly a straight shot from one to the other. So we have two principal forms of motion that take place in the GI tract. There's peristalsis and there's segmentation. All right, so peristalsis, people have usually heard of. And this is the moving forward of the contents of the GI tract. And essentially, this is accomplished by contraction behind the bolus. A bolus is just a food ball or a ball of something. In this case, it's a ball of chewed up food, let's say. So by contracting behind that ball in a sequential pattern, that ball can be propelled forward. So if you were trying to move an egg through, a sock, you would do the same thing, right? You'd put your fingers behind the sock and you'd kind of push the egg, or behind the egg, and you'd kind of push the egg through the sock. Well, that's exactly how peristalsis works, is there's a wave of contraction that literally pushes this ball forward, right? Okay, so that's peristalsis. The other motion is called segmentation, and that is represented here. So by contracting around, so we're not moving forward here. So nothing is moving, it's stationary. But as the walls contract around this material, it essentially gets mixed up, right? Segmentation is a mixing action. Because what we want is the contents of the GI tract to stay sort of uniform. So by contracting in these alternating ways, we go from this to this. So the shape is the same, but the contents have been mixed up in this process. So that's segmentation. We see this principally in the large and small intestine, where not only do we want to keep things mixed up, but we also want to put that mucosa, that innermost wall, right next to the contents. So by squeezing around it, the body is pushing that mucosa in towards the contents that we want to digest and then absorb. All right. So we're going to talk about what takes place in the lumen. And I know we've used that word before, but just so as a refresher, the lumen is the inside of the tube, right? So in the GI tract, that's this area. And lots of things in the body have lumens. Our arteries have a lumen. That's where the blood flows. Veins, that's where the blood flows as well. Lymphatics, so very common word. I just wanted to remind you what it meant. All right. So the GI tract is sort of unique in the body because it comes with its own nervous system. So in some ways, the digestive tract manages itself. Well, based on what? Based on local factors. Okay, so what does that mean? As contents move through the digestive tract, as they're digested, as they're absorbed, as secretion into that tract happens, all of those changes to the local region trigger responses from the cells in that region. So lining the inside surface here are our epithelial cells, our intestinal epithelial cells, and they respond to the contents of the GI tract depending on what it is. So, for example, if it's highly acidic, the system might respond with an alkaline solution to cancel that acidity. If it's very alkaline, it might respond with an acid solution to cancel that alkalinity. So the response of the GI tract to what's inside it is sort of automatic and local. It doesn't require any nervous system input. All right, so, and then because the GI tract has its own nervous system as well, these local factors can be communicated over great distances in the GI tract through its own enteric nervous system. So we would call those the myenteric reflexes. So when we talked about the autonomic nervous system last semester, we talked about how there's the sympathetic, the parasympathetic, and then the enteric. The enteric nervous system is the nervous system of the GI tract that allows that system to sort of control itself. Now, for big things and big control, the brain can still be involved. So here's the CNS, right? So in what we call a long reflex, these local factors will trigger a signal to the brain, and then the brain will respond with a modifying or a modulating signal back to the GI tract. So one of the take-home messages here is the brain doesn't control digestion. The GI tract controls digestion all by itself. The brain just modifies or modulates that control. So it's the manager, but the work is constantly being done by the GI tract. All right, so that's the second layer, is neural control. And then we'll see that hormones are another way that the GI tract controls itself. Hormones from one region reach another region and cause a change there. So, for example, the hormones from the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, play a major role in controlling the stomach, which is the region that comes before it. And that control is all via hormones. So we have local factors that include that enteric nervous system, then the neural control and hormonal control. So 3 general methods for controlling the GI tract. All right. So we already talked about digestion, okay, so that it has that specific definition, taking large molecules, turning them into smaller ones. And the digestive tract, just like every organ system we talk about, it has multiple functions. So the first is ingestion. Before there's anything for the digestive tract to do, something has to be put into it. So we call that process of eating and drinking ingestion. So that's food and liquid come into the system. There's mechanical processing. This begins with the mouth. So the teeth and the jaws together process the food that has been taken in mechanically. And what we mean by that is physically. In other words, they've been pushed around, they've been squashed, they've been torn up, they've been mixed up. That process continues in the stomach and in the small intestine through segmentation and contraction of the muscle that's present there. All right, so there's mechanical processing. Digestion, the breakdown of large molecules into smaller ones. Secretion, where stuff is put into the GI tract to accomplish digestion, to make that happen. We'll see some examples of that from the liver and from the pancreas. And then we have absorption. In a sense, that's the whole point of the process, which is to bring in what the body needs. So electrolytes, building block molecules, vitamins, water, all those things have to be absorbed. And then finally, compaction. We end up putting a lot into the digestive tract to accomplish absorption and digestion. We want to recover that, our investment, so to speak. So particularly in the large intestine, water and other valuable materials are pulled back out of the GI tract so that by the time the feces exits, it doesn't contain much of anything that we could have used, right? So that process is called compaction. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the large intestine later on. All right, so we start our journey at the top. So we're going to look at each part of the GI tract first, and then we'll go and we'll add those accessory organs on Friday, probably. All right, so the oral cavity. So we've seen some of this already because we looked at the nasal cavity in the respiratory chapter. Well, now we get to focus on the bottom part of that, of the head. The entry to the mouth is the lips, or the labium. So we have our upper lip and lower lip. And then just behind the lips, we have the teeth, which we've got a better picture of later. We got the cheek on the sides. The tongue is this huge thing right here. So, when we look in the mirror and say, we're only seeing this top part of the tongue. So the tongue is a fascinating muscle because it's skeletal muscle, but the arrangement of fibers is such that it can move in all kinds of different directions. So it's one of the few muscles in the body that can move in many different ways. But it fills this whole bottom part of the jaw. Off to the side is the palatine tonsil, which we talked about in the lymphatic system. The root of the tongue is just this base part. Here's the lingual tonsil, which we also already talked about. And if we look at the top, the palate is the top of the mouth, or the roof of the mouth, and it has 2 parts. So part of it, which is right here, is bony, so it's hard, and we call it, not surprisingly, the hard palate. And then hanging off the back of that bony plate is this floppy part that we call the soft palate. And at the end of the soft palate, we have the uvula, the end and in the middle, and that's the thing that hangs down in the back of the throat. Better picture of that next. But, okay, so that's the oral cavity. If we look at it clinically, like, how will we see it in a patient? All right, so we have the labium, so the lip. At the top and bottom, so it's upper lip and lower lip, there's a sort of stringy-like bit of tissue right in the center. And we call that a frenulum. A frenulum means tie, a tie, a thing that ties two things together. So we have the labial frenulum at the top and bottom. Then we have the teeth, more on that in a second. The tongue also has a frenulum. So underneath the part of the tongue that can move around, again, there's a tie that sort of anchors the tongue to the base of the mouth. Hugely variable, the lingual frenulum. Some people have a frenulum that goes almost to the tip of the tongue. Some people barely have one at all. So there's a lot of individual variability there. If we look at the back, we can see, we call these the pharyngeal arches here. There's the uvula. There's the palatine tonsil. Here's the hard palate up here. So all structures that you can see sort of from the front. All right, well, what about the teeth? Well, teeth have essentially three regions: the crown, the neck, and the root. So the crown is the part that you can see, it sticks up. The neck is sort of the part that's anchored in the gum line. And then the root sits buried in the jaw or the maxillary bones, depending on if you're talking about the top or bottom. And the teeth are anchored in that bone by their roots here. And the roots have many small, tough strings that attach the tooth to the bone, right? And then reinforcing those strings is a substance called cementum. Very clever name, right? Because it cements the teeth into the jaw. So those strings that hold it in place, those are called periodontal ligaments. And they're very, very strong. So even though they're very small, they very securely hold this tooth in place. But they also give the tooth a little bit of motion. The tooth can move a little because these periodontal ligaments provide a sort of suspension system for the teeth. And then at the top, the crown, the part we see that's white, that's enamel. Enamel's the hardest substance in the body, so significantly harder than bone is. And well, it should be, because the teeth undergo some, pretty high stresses when we are chewing. And then occlusal just means closed. So the occlusal surface is the part of the teeth that match with the teeth above or below them, right? So when your mouths are closed, your teeth sort of fit together, right? That's the occlusal surface, is where they fit with the teeth above them or below them. All right. All right, so we have multiple types of teeth, and this is where I say this is not a dentist class, or this isn't dental. So I'm not interested in you knowing all this teeth stuff. I do want you to know that last slide, because that's the basic anatomy of a tooth. But from that, you don't have to know this stuff. Just know that we have different kinds of teeth, and the teeth do different things, right? And, because it is a biology class, the human's set of teeth sort of stands out in the animal kingdom. Even though, the predators like dogs and cats and that kind of thing have cooler looking teeth in some ways, we have a wide variety of teeth because of all the different kinds of things we eat. So it's an omnivore thing that we have all of these different types of teeth. And we get two sets. So these are baby teeth. They start coming in usually between 6 months and a year. And the last ones come in between 2 and 3, right? So there's 10 on the top, 10 on the bottom. Those fall out and are replaced by the adult teeth, and there's quite a few more of them, particularly in the molar department. One of the reasons that we evolved like this is probably because we could not have fit all of the adult teeth in a child's mouth, right? So we needed to have sort of two sets to make that work. Another reason is probably from decay. Before the advent of dentists and toothpaste and things like that, the teeth didn't last very long. So it was good that we had a second set come in. It extended our lifespan, or at least our teeth's lifespan. All right, so here again, you can sort of cross that off because you don't have to know any of that stuff. All right, the pharynx we have talked about already. So this should be just a review. We have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Now, the nasopharynx is strictly a respiratory region. right? We don't eat through our nose. But the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are shared between those two. And probably the most critical part of that relationship, sharing the respiratory and digestive tract, is swallowing. When we swallow solids or liquids, we have to pass through the oropharynx and part of the laryngopharynx, but we have to avoid the larynx and the entry to the lungs. So we have a complex sort of reflex that accomplishes that, which we'll see, I think, at the end of today. All right. Okay, so that was the mouth, oral cavity, right? So connecting the back of the oral cavity with the stomach, the top of the stomach, is this simple muscular tube called the esophagus. And all the esophagus does is shuttle swallowed food or liquid from here down to here. Because, of course, the thorax is taken up with the heart and lungs, right? So we just have to get down here to the GI tract to finish the digestion. So when we look at the esophagus under the microscope, it looks a little bit like this. So it's folded, but the lumen is right here, in clear here, right? And it's folded like this because when we swallow something, it stretches out. So as this folded thing has something that passes through it, it stretches out, and then it goes back to this shape. So the top third of the esophagus is skeletal muscle. So technically we have control of it, although it is typically controlled unconsciously. The middle third is a mixture of skeletal muscle and smooth muscle, and then the distal third is all smooth muscle. So a thing people describe is, you chew and then you swallow, and there is the sensation of the food moving into the chest, but then it that sensation disappears. We don't really feel it enter the stomach. And the reason for that is the skeletal muscle parts of the esophagus send signals to the conscious awareness, to the brain, right? The smooth muscle parts don't. There we go. So we don't have sort of sensation all the way down. Okay, so that's one part, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And then at the top and at the bottom, the esophagus behaves as though it's a sphincter. A sphincter is a muscle that seals or closes an opening or a tube, right? So the upper part of the first part of the upper part of the esophagus, it stays closed all the time, unless there's something passing through it. And it acts as a kind of valve that prevents, or at least reduces, the amount of air that enters the GI tract. So as long as the top part of the tube is closed, the air will go into the lungs where it belongs, right? So we call that the upper esophageal sphincter. And then down here at the bottom, where the esophagus meets the stomach, we have another region of the esophagus that stays tightly closed all the time. And that is the lower esophageal sphincter, or LES. That's the more famous one because when the lower esophageal sphincter isn't working right, that's one of the causes of acid reflux disease, right? Heartburn can be caused by a relaxed or loose lower esophageal sphincter. And some of the things that typically cause heartburn do so because of their effect at that part. So for example, caffeine and alcohol both relax the lower esophageal sphincter. And those are two common triggers for heartburn. So the LES, or lower esophageal sphincter.
Is that ever fixable, like chronic heartburn?
Typically what they fix is the amount of acid that's produced. Because there used to be some medicines that tightened up the lower esophageal sphincter, but they're off the market now because they cause other problems. So no, they typically don't fix it that way. They fix it by turning your acid production down.
How does it get relaxed if you don't drink and you don't?
Some people's it's just relaxed. The thing is, it's a functional sphincter. In other words, if you look anatomically, you won't see anything different in anybody about the lower end of that. It's all about how it behaves. So some people, genetic, nervous system, differences. Some people still doesn't contract very well. Yeah. All right. Okay, so swallowing. We divide the swallowing reflex into 3 phases, okay? The buccal phase is how it starts, okay? So I'm taking a bite of something, chew, 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 right? That is not the buccal phase yet. The buccal phase starts when now you've made a food ball, right? It's got saliva mixed in there and it's kind of ball shaped. When the tongue pushes that back to the back of the throat, the soft palate is sort of pushed up by the bolus, and that is the buccal phase. It's what triggers the involuntary act of swallowing, right? So why is swallowing not voluntary? Because there's all these things that have to happen, and they have to happen relatively quickly. So swallowing is involuntary so that it happens the same way every time. And we don't get food or drink in the airway, and we don't get air in the GI tract, at least not very much. All right, so the tongue pushes that to the back of the throat. Once it contacts the pharynx here at the back and the uvula and soft palate, the involuntary takes over. So in the pharyngeal phase, the bolus is moved down the pharynx, and a couple of points to make. You can see that the soft palate has closed the nasal cavity here, right, at the top. And the bolus has pushed the epiglottis. See the epiglottis here? It's been folded over to form a kind of trap door over the larynx. So the bolus sort of slides past here. At this point as well, the glottis is closed. So even if this trap door effect doesn't work, there still is, you're not going to get stuff down into your lungs because the doorway, remember the doorway that opens and closes? The doorway is closed, so nothing can get through. All right. And then the last phase is the esophageal phase. So once we've crossed because here's the larynx, so the pharyngeal phase is sort of the most critical phase because that's where we're bypassing the airway and going down the esophagus instead. Once we get into the top of the esophagus, peristalsis takes over, and that food ball is pushed then into the stomach where digestion can continue. So an important reminder is, even though gravity is in our favor here, there is no this is not a gravity-run system. In other words, food is moved from the mouth to the stomach through muscular contraction, not by falling, right? It's one of the reasons why you really can, swallow while standing on your head, what you can do, because the esophagus works that way all the time, which is, it's not allowing things to fall, it's moving stuff from point A to point B. All right, so we're going to look at our last 5 minutes, or last couple minutes. All right, so we're looking at an X-ray from the side. So this is the skull, right? So here's the cranium, here's the jaw, right here. Here are the vertebral column, right here. And what we're going to see is this person's going to chew and swallow some material that is easy to see under X-ray. So let's hear it.
It's the same as a swallow study?
Yes, that's exactly what this is. Okay, hopefully it'll work. There we go. Okay, so chewing a small amount there, see it? Now watch this region. So buccal phase, boom. See how fast that is? That's the pharyngeal phase is that rapid part. So you see that he's going to push it back to the back, and then from there, the pharyngeal phase takes over and it goes right through. Okay, so now we got liquid. There we go. Easier, faster. You can see the tongue here. So buccal phase is pushing it back, and then pharyngeal phase is crossing over, and then from there it's esophageal phase all the way down. All right, cool picture.
It's funny how you can see how the muscle closes the pathway to the lung.
Yep. All right, so that's it. We're out of time for today.